Clara May had climbed into the attic looking for a box of canning jars, but what she found instead still carried the scent of lavender and longing. The old attic groaned as she moved through it, ducking under beams and brushing cobwebs from cardboard boxes with frayed corners and faded handwriting. Light filtered through a dusty window, catching in the air like drifting glitter. She had only meant to find a few mason jars for Grandma Mabel's fig preserves recipe, an excuse to feel a little closer to a woman she hadn't seen in years. But tucked in the back, beneath a roll of yellowed Christmas wrapping and a cracked globe, sat a box that stopped her cold. For Clara, keep safe. The label read in her mother's elegant cursive, faded almost to invisibility. She crouched down slowly, her knees creaking with the motion, and ran her hand across the top. It smelled like cedar and faint lavender, the kind her mother used to tuck into dresser drawers and sewing baskets. She hadn't seen that handwriting in over 5 years, not since the funeral. Her throat tightened. The box wasn't taped, only tied with a long strip of blue muslin, like a secret that still wanted to be opened. Carefully, she unwrapped it and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue and love, was a wedding dress. Not just any dress. Ivory soft, slightly yellowed at the edges, but undeniably beautiful. The lace sleeves were unfinished, a bodice stitched by hand, uneven in places with a neckline that curved like a smile. It was delicate, incomplete, familiar. She didn't breathe for a moment. Beneath the dress was a folded card. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. For my Clara, may you always feel beautiful in who you are, not just what you wear. No signature, none was needed. Downstairs, the creak of the front door and a burst of voices signaled the arrival of the Sunday supper crowd. Her cousin Savannah's laugh, always a little too loud, floated up like steam from a pot of gumbo. Clara folded the card and tucked it back into the folds of the dress, then replaced the lid and tied the muslin ribbon again. She descended the stairs as if sleepwalking. The kitchen was already full of cousins passing paper plates and aunts gossiping over casserole dishes. A lemon meringue pie cooled on the counter beside a pitcher of sweet tea sweating in the warmth. Clara's father, Frank, waved from the patio door, mouth full of deviled eggs. It was a typical Southern gathering, familiar and chaotic. Savannah stood at the center like a debutante glowing from her recent engagement. Her fiancé, Rhett, stood nearby, polite and quiet, already lost in the sea of relatives. Clara poured herself a glass of tea and tried to stay unnoticed. I have an announcement. Savannah clapped her hands together, beaming. The chatter dimmed as all eyes turned to her. We've set the date, May 28th. Church ceremony, of course, and Aunt Susan says we can use the garden for the reception. Clara looked toward her aunt, who smiled and gave a proud nod. And, Savannah added, twirling slightly, I'll be wearing the family wedding dress. Clara nearly dropped her glass. Applause broke out around the room. Clara's eyes darted to her father, who simply nodded, looking pleased. Savannah's mother, Susan, caught Clara's eye and said brightly, "Oh, honey, it's such a blessing to keep traditions alive, don't you think?" Clara forced a smile. "Whose dress exactly?" "Your mother's, of course," Susan said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She would have loved seeing it worn again. No one looked at Clara as she opened her mouth, then closed it. The moment had passed. Later that evening, after the last car pulled away and the porch light buzzed with June bugs, Clara slipped back into the attic. The box was where she left it. She opened it slowly this time, her movements deliberate. The smell of lavender rose like a ghost. She lifted the dress into her arms, letting it spill gently over her lap. The fabric was cooler than she expected. Smooth and soft, it curled around her fingers like a sleeping memory. She traced the neckline, the uneven stitches, the thread still dangling from one sleeve. She didn't remember her mother ever sitting at a machine with it. Maybe it had been sewn late at night. Maybe it had never been finished because her mother didn't know if she'd get the chance to see Clara wear it. Turning the gown over, Clara spotted something near the inner seam. She leaned closer. There, barely visible in the lining, was a signature embroidered by hand. SM 2003 for CM. Her mother made it. For her. She held the dress close, forehead resting on the lace, heart aching with the weight of things never said, never finished, never worn. She noticed a signature in tiny hand stitching near the lining. SM 2003 for CM. Her mother made it. For her. Clara's hands worked steadily over the old lace hem, but her chest felt tight with every tug of the thread. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window at Miss Patty's bridal and formal repair, catching flecks of dust dancing in the quiet. Gospel music played softly from a radio on the shelf above the pressing table. Clara sat hunched on a stool near the back, smoothing a length of lace across her lap. Her fingers were swift and sure, weaving invisible mends through delicate fabric. She always found a certain calm in restoring gowns from another lifetime, quiet work that required care and no small amount of reverence. But today, the calm wasn't coming. Each stitch felt like she was reinforcing something fragile inside her. The night before had been a haze. Climbing down from the attic with the box still cradled in her arms, the ache in her chest too full for words. The signature sewn into the lining haunted her. It wasn't just a dress, it was a love letter in fabric, unfinished and unseen. She shook herself back to the present as the bell above the shop door jingled. Mrs. Ruby stepped inside with the kind of grace only certain Southern women carried, slow, steady, like she was walking through a field of memories. She wore a floral scarf and carried a dress bag with both hands as if it held porcelain. "Afternoon, darlin'," she said, her voice smooth as warm syrup. "I've got a gown that's been sleeping too long. Thought maybe you could wake it up for me." Clara stood, brushing threads from her lap. "Let me take a look." Mrs. Ruby unzipped the bag to reveal a tea-length gown from the 1960s, ivory with pearl buttons and a yellowed satin sash. "It was my mama's," she said. "Wore it to her second wedding. Lord, she looked like a movie star. I want to preserve it, maybe pass it along if I ever get a granddaughter who's not allergic to history." Clara smiled, carefully lifting the gown and spreading it over the work table. "It's beautiful. These pleats were done by hand." "Mm-hmm," Ruby hummed. "Women had time for detail back then. Now folks just click and ship. Ain't the same?" Clara nodded as she inspected the seams. "It'll take a couple weeks to stabilize the lining and treat the yellowing, but we can do it." Ruby looked at her for a long moment. "You've got your mama's quiet and her hands. That's a compliment, sugar." Clara blinked. "Thank you." As Ruby turned to go, the door jingled again. Savannah breezed in, sunglasses pushed onto her head, a veil sample dangling from one hand. "Clara," she called across the room. "Don't forget you're supposed to fix that dress for me." Clara went still. Savannah approached the counter, flipping her phone in her palm. "You know, the one in the attic. Mom says you'll probably need to let out the bust and reinforce the sleeves." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. "You mean my mother's dress?" Savannah laughed. "Well, yeah, but you're the one with the skills, right?" "Seems fair." Ruby watched the exchange quietly. "I'll check the fabric later," Clara said, voice clipped. Savannah gave a careless wave and turned to examine some tiaras on display. "I want something understated. Elegant but not boring, and no puff sleeves." As the bell jingled again behind her, Ruby gently rested her hand on Clara's arm. "That dress in the attic," she said, voice low, "wasn't meant for her, was it?" Clara swallowed hard. "It was mine. My mother made it before she passed. No one ever asked if I wanted it." Ruby nodded slowly. "Some things aren't meant to be handed down. They're meant to be handed back." Clara looked at her, unsure what that meant. Ruby smiled. "You'll see." Later that evening, Clara sat by the open window of her bedroom, the scent of honeysuckle wafting in. She'd spent the rest of the day repairing the lining of Ruby's dress, the steady rhythm soothing her nerves. Yet something Ruby said kept echoing in her mind. Some things are meant to be handed back. Outside, the porch light flickered on. Clara rose to close the curtains when she noticed a car pulling into the driveway. A boxy old Lincoln, unfamiliar. A tall woman stepped out, dressed in soft gray, her silver hair pulled into a bun. She moved slowly, with the kind of stillness that made you lean in rather than look away. Clara recognized her before her brain caught up. Grandma Mabel. Clara's breath caught. She hadn't seen her since the funeral 5 years ago. Mabel had left town quietly with no explanation. She hadn't written, hadn't called, just gone. Now she was walking up the porch steps with a small suitcase and a sewing kit under one arm. Clara returned home that evening and found the attic window open. Her dress form had been slightly moved. Someone's coming. The knock at the door was soft, but it carried the weight of every secret Clara didn't know she needed to hear. She hesitated before opening it. Her hand hovered on the doorknob, unsure whether she was ready to face the woman on the other side. But something in the air, perhaps the same stillness Ruby had hinted at, told her this moment had been a long time coming. When she opened the door, Grandma Mabel stood quietly on the porch, framed by the glow of the porch light. Her silver hair was pinned neatly back, her clothes modest, travel wrinkled, but she stood as though she'd never left. In her right hand, she held a worn leather sewing kit with initials burned into the side. Clara remembered it instantly. Mabel didn't speak at first. She just looked at Clara, eyes steady, soft but unreadable. Then she gave a small nod, like the kind you give to a song that says what you couldn't. "Hi, baby girl," she said, voice low and familiar. Clara's throat caught, but she stepped back and let her in. The living room hadn't changed much since Mabel's last visit. The same patchwork quilt draped over the recliner, the same ticking wall clock, now quieter somehow. Frank's boots sat by the door. The house smelled of cinnamon and something floral, like memory layered on memory. Clara led her into the kitchen, where a half-filled mug of tea still sat on the counter, long gone cold. Mabel set down her bag and looked around like she was taking inventory of a life paused. "You look like your mama," she said simply. Clara lowered her eyes. "I found the dress." Mabel raised her brow, but didn't ask which one. Instead, she opened the suitcase she'd brought and pulled out a yellowed paper pattern, worn at the folds, then a bundle wrapped in muslin. She set it gently on the table and began to unwrap it, layer by layer, until a second wedding dress appeared. This one was different. Not ivory like the attic dress. It shimmered faintly under the overhead light, with embroidery along the hem that looked almost like waves or vines. It was hard to tell which. It was unfinished, too, but the craftsmanship made Clara's breath catch. Mabel touched it with reverence. "Your mama started this one the summer after you were born," she said. "Said she wanted something unique for you, just in case." "In case of what?" "In case life didn't turn out the way folks expected." Clara ran her hand over the fabric. It was softer than the other, worn in places, but strong, just like the woman who'd started it. Mabel took a deep breath, then reached into her kit and pulled out a pincushion shaped like a pear, her trademark tool. Clara remembered it from childhood visits, how Mabel always let her press the pins in, color by color, like a game only they understood. She handed it to Clara now. "I think it's time you finished it." Before Clara could respond, the back door swung open and Frank stepped in, startled to see his mother-in-law standing in his kitchen. "Mabel?" he said, voice rising halfway between surprise and apology. "Evening, Frank," Mabel replied without missing a beat. He blinked, then looked at Clara as if hoping for explanation. "She came to help with the dress," Clara said gently. Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know you were... it's been 5 years," Mabel said. "You let Susan's sister take the lead. I figured there was no room left for me." Frank shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Soon after, Susan and Savannah arrived, full of wedding chatter and weekend errands. Their voices carried into the kitchen, rising and falling like birdsong. Then Savannah's steps faltered as she saw the unfamiliar figure seated at the table. "Grandma Mabel," she said, blinking. "Hello, Savannah," Mabel answered, calm as ever. Susan, more cautious, approached slowly. "Mabel, we didn't expect—" "I know," she interrupted. "But I heard there's a dress being passed around like a church casserole, and I figured it was time someone remembered who made the recipe." Susan bristled, but Savannah just blinked again. Clara stepped beside Mabel, silent but steady. Savannah walked toward the box where the original attic dress had been placed, now folded and set to the side. She reached for it. "That's not yours to wear," Mabel said softly, not rising, not raising her voice. Savannah froze. "Excuse me?" Mabel finally stood, slow but unwavering. That dress was made by Susan May, for her daughter, not for display, not for convenience, and certainly not for someone who never asked if it was even hers to borrow. Susan opened her mouth, but the words caught. I think, Mabel added, you have plenty of other choices. Savannah looked at Clara, searching for something. Maybe resentment, maybe a way out. Clara met her gaze calmly. I won't stop you if you want to wear it, but you'd be wearing someone else's story. Savannah turned away, silent. In the quiet that followed, Mabel reached for the muslin bundle beside her and gently unfolded the second gown. She placed the gown in Clara's arms and said, Now, baby girl, let's make it yours. The sewing room smelled like cedar wood and thread, and for the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone in it. Sunlight streamed through the back window of Mabel's converted guest room, warming the wooden floorboards and catching dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. The old Singer sewing machine sat squarely beneath the window, its metal foot pedal worn smooth from decades of use. Clara stood nearby, the muslin bundle already unwrapped across the table. Mabel moved with quiet purpose, sorting spools of thread by color and weight. Her fingers, though slower than they used to be, still held the memory of their craft. Every motion felt intentional, like choreography passed down in blood. They didn't talk much at first. The hush between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that held space rather than tension. Outside, wind chimes clinked softly, and a pair of robins argued on the back fence. Clara unfolded the gown carefully and laid it across the cutting board. The fabric, though aged, was still strong. Hand-stitched embroidery followed the hem, faded in places but intricate and unmistakably her mother's style. Clara traced a line of stitching with her finger, the same way she once followed cracks in the sidewalk with the tip of her shoe. You always saw patterns, Mabel said without looking up. Your mama saw stories. Clara glanced at her. And you? I built the space for both. They worked through the morning, measuring and trimming, reattaching pearl buttons that had fallen loose over time. Clara's hands moved steadily, almost automatically, guided more by memory than instruction. Mabel didn't correct her, just watched, gently nodding when Clara made choices that felt right. At midday, the doorbell rang. Mabel wiped her hands on a flour sack towel and went to answer it. Moments later, she returned with Mrs. Ruby and a rectangular tin wrapped in faded gingham. Hope I'm not interrupting, Ruby said, already placing the tin on the table. Brought y'all some coffee cake, cinnamon pecan, still warm if you're lucky. Clara smiled. Thank you. Ruby settled into the chair opposite her, watching the gown take shape. This was hers, wasn't it? She asked softly. Clara nodded. She never finished it. Well, Ruby said, lifting the corner of the hem, neither did I with mine. But that's life, sugar. Most stories aren't meant to end perfect, just honest. She reached into her purse and pulled out a length of pale blue ribbon, worn but clean. This was in my mama's wedding gown. I've been holding onto it for 50 years. Think maybe it's ready for its next adventure. Clara took it with both hands. Are you sure? Darlene, I'm older than secrets. I know when something needs to be passed along. They sewed the ribbon into the inner seam, hidden but present, like all the women who had come before. As the afternoon wore on, the dress transformed. What had once been a fragment of loss began to look whole. Mabel showed Clara how to reinforce the waist, how to pleat the back for movement, how to hide stitches so they sang without shouting. At one point, Mabel paused to stretch her back and said, You know, your mama wanted to open a shop. Clara looked up. She did. Called it Clara and Company in her sketchbook. Said it would be part heirloom, part imagination. Clara blinked, her throat suddenly thick. She hadn't known that, not fully. By evening, the gown was nearly done. Clara stitched the final hem under the soft glow of a desk lamp, while Mabel pressed the bodice with care. The room smelled faintly of starch and old cedar. Clara signed the lining beneath the final fold, CM 2023, small and stitched in the same lavender thread her mother once used. She didn't cry, not exactly, but her breath caught as the needle slipped through the last loop, sealing not just fabric, but something deeper. Mabel ran a hand over the gown and said, This dress deserves to be seen. Clara didn't walk in looking for a spotlight, but somehow the room tilted toward her. The church fellowship hall was already bustling when she arrived, the rehearsal dinner in full swing. Folding chairs scraped gently against the tiled floor, and the scent of ham biscuits and deviled eggs lingered in the air. Long tables were dressed with gingham runners, and centerpieces made from mason jars filled with wildflowers. At the far end of the room, a banner hung from the rafters. Love bears all things, believes all things, in soft, looping calligraphy. Clara paused just inside the doorway. She wore a lilac dress she had altered herself. Soft fabric, simple lines, something that didn't demand attention, but didn't shrink from it either. Her hair was pulled back, loose and low, and a silver thimble-shaped pendant rested just below her collarbone. A few guests turned to look, their smiles genuine. "That must be Clara," she heard someone whisper. "Susan's girl. Heard she does wonders with lace." Clara gave a small nod in their direction and stepped further in. A tray of sweet tea and lemonade waited near the piano, already half empty. Pastor Ellison stood near the punch bowl, chatting with Mrs. Ruby and chuckling at something quietly said. "Clara," he called, noticing her. "Good to see you, child." She approached with a soft smile. "Hi, Pastor." "You look like your mama standing there," he said gently. "She'd be proud. That necklace, wasn't that hers?" Clara touched it instinctively. "Yes, I found it. With the dress." His expression softened. "I remember her drawing that gown in the church library after choir practice. Said she was making something that could speak when she no longer could." Clara didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. Before she could ask more, Savannah's voice rang out behind her. "There you are." Clara turned as her cousin approached, veil in hand, still clipped in the back with a plastic comb. Savannah's dress shimmered slightly under the overhead lights, pale pink with a sweetheart neckline. She looked polished, perfect, and completely unsettled. "Can I talk to you?" she said, already pulling Clara aside. They stepped behind the refreshment table, shielded from the crowd by a decorative lattice wrapped in ivy. Clara could feel her pulse tick in her throat. "What's going on?" Savannah asked. "Everyone keeps talking about you." Clara blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Ruby said something about a display. Pastor Ellison mentioned a dress. What's happening?" Clara's voice was even. "I'm showing Mom's gown, the one she started for me. Grandma Mabel and I finished it." Savannah scoffed. "You're displaying it? At my wedding?" Clara tilted her head. "In the church foyer, yes, not during the ceremony. It's a tribute." Savannah crossed her arms. "This is supposed to be about me." Clara didn't flinch. "It still is, but that dress, it's a piece of her, and she deserves to be remembered." Savannah looked away, jaw tight. "You always do this, make things emotional." "Complicated." Clara's voice stayed soft. "I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just don't want to keep giving things up that were never yours to claim." Savannah didn't respond. She adjusted her veil and turned back toward the main room, heels clicking a little too sharply. Later that evening, as guests mingled and music floated from the piano, Clara wheeled in the dress form, carefully wrapped and covered in muslin. Pastor Ellison helped her lift it into place, near the foyer window, where the late afternoon sun cast warm light across the wooden floors. Clara gently removed the cloth, revealing the finished gown. Gasps were quiet, reverent. The embroidery shimmered subtly beneath the chandelier. A small frame stood beside it, displaying a photo of her mother, seated at a sewing machine, and the handwritten note, "For my Clara, may you always feel beautiful in who you are, not just what you wear." Susan approached slowly. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the edge of the display, but she didn't touch. "I forgot," she whispered, eyes wet. "How much of her is in you?" Clara offered a small, sad smile. "I didn't." As more guests approached, Savannah hovered at the edge of the room. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Clara quietly placed the restored gown on a dress form in the church entryway under soft light, announcing she'll be displaying it at the wedding. Savannah's wedding was lovely, but the moment people remembered most happened after the last hymn had ended. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of the church sanctuary, scattering soft pools of color across the pews. The final notes of "Be Thou My Vision" lingered in the rafters as guests rose, murmuring about how beautiful the bride looked, how Rhett seemed like a good man, and how the hydrangeas in the garden had bloomed just in time. Clara stood near the church entrance, adjusting a small bouquet on the display beside her mother's wedding dress. The gown shimmered quietly on the dress form, catching the late afternoon light. A small wooden plaque at its base read, "Designed by Susan May for Clara May, 2003 to 2023. It was the last thing guests saw as they exited the ceremony, and it slowed them. People paused, whispered. Some placed a hand over their chest, others smiled quietly, eyes glassy. A few dabbed their cheeks with wrinkled handkerchiefs. The dress didn't cry for attention, but it commanded memory. Susan approached slowly, arms folded, the lines on her face softer than usual. "She'd have been proud," she said, not quite looking at Clara. Clara gave a small nod. "I like to think she is." Susan glanced at the plaque again. "I forgot how good she was, with her hands, with love." There was no bitterness in Clara's voice. "She left pieces of it everywhere, we just stopped looking." Susan's lips pressed together. "You're right." A quiet passed between them, not awkward, but necessary. Later, guests gathered in the church garden, where folding chairs lined the lawn and twinkle lights glowed from the trees. The air smelled of lemon pie and trimmed grass. Mabel sat on a wooden bench near the edge of the dance floor, watching with that same peaceful stillness she always carried. Clara joined her with a plate of pecan bars and 2 lemonades. "You did it," Mabel said, taking the glass. "The dress, the display, the way you stood still when they didn't know how." Clara looked out at the crowd, where Savannah twirled slowly with Rhett, her veil fluttering. "I just wanted her to be remembered right." "You did more than that, you reminded them who she was." Across the lawn, a small girl in a yellow sundress hovered near the dress display, her eyes wide. She couldn't have been more than 9, with loose curls and 2 missing front teeth. She looked up at Clara with curiosity, then shuffled closer. "Hi," the girl said. "Is that your dress?" Clara smiled. "It was made for me, yes." The girl tilted her head. "Did your grandma help you fix it?" "She sure did." "Did your mom teach you how to sew?" "Sort of. She taught me how to see." The girl was quiet for a moment and then pointed to the hem. "How do the flowers stay on like that?" Clara crouched beside her. "With thread, patience, and stories." The girl grinned. "Can you teach me?" Clara looked at her, really looked at her, the way her fingers itched to touch the fabric, the way she leaned in, hungry to know how things worked. It was like seeing herself, years ago, peeking around the corner of her mother's sewing table. Clara knelt and offered a folded scrap of lace. "This was part of my story. Want to start yours?" The girl nodded solemnly, as if accepting a secret. Later that summer, the church bulletin announced the opening of a new small business tucked just off Main Street, Clara and Company. Heirloom Restorations. The storefront was modest, painted pale blue, with a hand-lettered sign and lace curtains that danced in the window breeze. Inside, bolts of fabric lined the walls, vintage buttons glimmered in glass jars, and a single dress form stood near the window, wearing her mother's gown. On opening day, Mabel baked lemon shortbread, and Mrs. Ruby brought tulips from her garden. Frank arrived with a toolbox and quietly fixed the squeaky hinge on the front door. Susan came too, holding a picture frame, a photo of Susan May at her sewing table, grinning with thread between her teeth. That afternoon, Clara taught her first student. Ella sat cross-legged on a cushion, eyes wide, hands clutching a needle and scrap fabric. She reminded everyone of someone different, and everyone of someone the same. Clara knelt and offered a scrap of lace. "This was part of my story. Want to start yours?" Some dresses are stitched with more than thread. They carry the hands, hearts, and hopes of those who came before us. In a world quick to label and move on, Clara's quiet persistence reminded us that kindness doesn't need applause, and that true worth often lies beneath the surface. Just like a hidden seam or a whisper of lace, compassion works in silence, but it endures. When we choose not to judge, we leave space for grace to step in. And maybe, just maybe, a simple act of goodness today will become someone's heirloom tomorrow.